kidnappers spoke a dialect so rare, barely 1,000 souls on Earth still understood it, and one of them was carrying a tray of appetizers. When the 911 operator replayed that ransom call, it was gibberish. But the waitress, a young Moroccan woman named Sarah, caught a few words and froze. She knew that voice. She knew the landmarks it was describing. And she had to convince the FBI that she knew exactly where the girl was before the 3-hour deadline ran out. The deadline wasn't a movie plot. It was March 11th, and the girl was Layla Al-Rahman, the 5-year-old daughter of Khalid Al-Rahman, a man whose oil empire had made him untouchable until a single phone call in a crowded Manhattan restaurant turned him into the most helpless father on Earth. The kidnappers demanded $5 million, but their real weapon wasn't greed. It was a vanishing dialect spoken only in a cluster of villages in Morocco's Atlas Mountains. No FBI translator could parse it. No software could decode it. The only person in that restaurant who understood the ransom call was a 24-year-old waitress named Sarah, and she had never felt more invisible in her life. Khalid Al-Rahman had built a fortress around his daughter, private security at the gates of their Upper East Side townhouse, a driver trained in evasive maneuvers, a school that catered to children of diplomats where every visitor was photographed and every exit monitored. He had survived 2 business wars, a hostile takeover attempt that made international headlines, and a decade of threats from people who believed his oil money was stolen from their land. But the nightmare didn't breach his walls. It found him in a restaurant full of witnesses in plain daylight while he was cutting into a $40 steak. Layla was 5 years old. Her mother, Nadia, had died of a stroke 18 months earlier, and since then, Khalid had poured his grief into protecting the only piece of her he had left. The girl had her mother's eyes, large and dark and impossibly curious, and her father's stubbornness. She loved ice cream before dinner, refused to wear shoes in the apartment, and believed that her father could solve any problem just by picking up the phone. On the morning of March 11th, she had skipped into her classroom clutching a drawing of a camel she'd made the night before. Khalid had kissed her forehead and promised to take her to the carousel in Central Park that weekend. He had no reason to suspect that by lunchtime, his entire world would be reduced to a single, incomprehensible phone call. The restaurant was Le Chateau, a French-Moroccan fusion spot on Madison Avenue where Khalid was a regular. He dined there with 2 of his senior executives, discussing a pipeline deal in the Gulf, when his phone buzzed. The caller ID showed a blocked number. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something, he'd later tell investigators it was a cold whisper at the back of his neck, made him answer. The voice on the other end was male, deliberate, and utterly unintelligible, not because of static or a bad connection. The language itself was Arabic, but filtered through a lens Khalid had never encountered in his 40 years of doing business across the Middle East and North Africa. It was guttural, rapid, studded with consonants that didn't belong in the Arabic he knew. Berber phrases spliced into the sentences like thorns. He caught the word Layla 3 times. He caught 5 million. And he caught the sound of his daughter crying in the background, a sound he would have recognized anywhere, a sound that turned his blood to ice. Khalid's lunch companions saw his face drain. He stood up so fast his knife clattered to the floor. "Write it down," he shouted into the phone, his hands trembling. "Write it." The line went dead. He dialed his daughter's school. The headmistress answered in tears. Layla had vanished during recess. No one had seen a thing. The kidnappers had taken her from a playground surrounded by security cameras and guards, and it was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Within 20 minutes, the FBI's child abduction rapid deployment team had taken over Le Chateau's private dining room. They instructed the restaurant staff to stay put, no phones, no exits. The 911 operator had recorded the ransom call, and now 4 agents huddled around a laptop, playing it back again and again, their faces pinched with a frustration Khalid didn't understand. Finally, the lead agent, a woman named Rebecca Torres, pulled him aside. "Mr. Al-Rahman, the kidnappers are speaking a dialect our linguists can't identify. It's Arabic-based, but heavily mixed with an indigenous Berber variant. They're giving location instructions, landmarks, a handoff point, We've got analysts from Langley on the line and they're stumped. She paused, and Khalid saw something he'd never seen in a federal agent's eyes before: fear. We have 3 hours. If we can't translate this call, we're blind. And these people, they're not bluffing. In the kitchen, scrubbing plates in a steel sink, a 24-year-old woman named Sarah had stopped working. Her hands were still under the warm water, but her mind was racing through a childhood she had tried to bury. The words she'd overheard through the swinging door were not alien to her. They were home. Sarah had been born in a stone house in the village of Imsker, high in the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, a place so remote that the roads didn't reach it until 2006. Her grandmother, Yena Acha, had never spoken a word of French or Standard Arabic. She spoke only a dialect of Tashil Hit that was particular to 5 villages tucked into the valleys around Jebel Taubkul. It was a tongue that had survived centuries of empire and invasion because no outsider had ever bothered to learn it. When Sarah's father died in a mining accident, the family had scattered. At 18, she'd taken a job in Marrakesh, then saved enough to cross the sea and find her way to New York. She'd been invisible ever since, a busgirl, a dishwasher, a waitress who spoke 6 languages but never bragged about it because no one ever asked. Now, listening to the muffled recording through the wall, she caught a phrase her grandmother used to scare her into staying close to the house, the place where the red rock splits. Another phrase, the old Frenchman's water. She knew exactly what those landmarks were. They described a dry riverbed and a crumbling colonial well about 2 kilometers from Imsker. She hadn't been there since she was a child, but she could draw it from memory. Sarah dried her hands on her apron and walked out of the kitchen. She pushed past a uniformed officer who tried to block her, and then she said 7 words to Agent Tors that changed everything. I know where they are holding her. The room went silent. The recording stopped. Every agent in the room turned to look at a waitress in a stained apron, a woman who had spent her entire American life being overlooked, and who now held the only key that could save a little girl's life. Agent Tors stared at her. The clock on the wall read 2 hours and 47 minutes remaining. And somewhere, in a cold stone building 6,000 miles away, Layla Al-Rahman was waiting for a rescue that depended entirely on whether the world would believe a stranger with a grandmother's ghost in her voice. Agent Tors didn't blink. In 12 years with the Bureau, she'd seen witnesses crack under pressure, fabricate stories for attention, and confuse memory with wishful thinking. A kitchen worker claiming to understand a language that had stumped the NSA, that was a first. She pulled Sarah into the restaurant's wine cellar, a low-ceilinged room smelling of cork and damp stone, and pinned her with a stare that had broken liars twice her size. Tell me exactly what you heard, word for word. If you're guessing, say so. If you're certain, prove it. Sarah didn't flinch. She had survived worse than a federal agent's skepticism. She had survived a father's funeral, a crossing from Tangier in the cargo hold of a truck, a boss in Brooklyn who'd stolen 3 months of her wages and dared her to report it. So she straightened her apron, looked Tors in the eye, and recited the kidnapper's words in the original Berber-inflected Arabic, then translated them into English. The place where the red rock splits, that's Takliti Gorge, a dry riverbed 2 kilometers east of Imsker. The old Frenchman's water is Bir al-Nasrani, a well dug by colonial engineers in 1928. My grandmother's house was 500 meters from it. The voice on the recording said to leave the money at the foot of the old Frenchman's water, beneath the stone shaped like a sleeping camel. I know that stone. I sat on it as a child while my grandmother collected herbs. It's still there. Tors said nothing for a long moment. Then she pulled out her phone and called the FBI's linguistic unit at Quantico. On speaker, she played the recording while Sarah listened, repeating each phrase and translating it in real time. The analyst on the other end, a gray-haired professor who'd spent 40 years cataloging North African dialects, went silent. Who is that? He finally asked. A witness, Tors said. Is she accurate? She's translating a dialect I've been trying to map for a decade. There are fewer than 1,200 native speakers left. My entire team couldn't have done what she just did. I'd stake my career on her. That was enough for Tors. She radioed the field office and ordered a full tactical briefing. Within 30 minutes, the restaurant had become a command center. Maps of Morocco's High Atlas region were taped to the walls. Satellite imagery streamed onto laptops. Khalid Al-Rahman stood in the corner, his face shell-shocked, a billionaire reduced to a man who could only pray. But there was a problem, and it was bigger than geography. The kidnappers had given a 3-hour deadline for the money drop, but that drop was supposed to happen in Manhattan, not Morocco. The recording contained location information, but the actual exchange instructions remained garbled, deliberately so. They'd used the dialect as a filter. Only someone who understood both the words and the cultural context could decode the full message. Sarah sat down with the recording, a notepad, and a cup of black coffee. She listened 10 times, 20. On the 14th pass, her hand froze over the page. "They're not in Morocco," she said, "or at least the person giving the instructions isn't." The room went still. "The landmarks are meant to confuse us. They're using them as a code." The place where the red rock splits is a reference to a local legend, the story of the split stone where two lovers were separated and turned to rock. It's not a location, it's a threat. It means if you don't follow instructions, the child will be split from you forever. They're telling us the consequences, not the destination. Tors motioned for her to continue. The actual location is embedded in the Berber phrases. They're using ancient directional terms that only shepherds and goat herders know. Follow the path of the dying sun means west. Where the wind sings through 3 hollows means a valley with 3 caves. There's a cluster of caves in the Adirondack Mountains, 4 hours north of the city. The FBI found nothing when they searched, but they were looking for professional holding sites, not natural formations known only to someone who grew up in a specific Moroccan village. This was the pivot. The kidnapper wasn't an international cartel. This was someone local to the region. Someone who'd known those caves before coming to America. Someone with a personal connection to that village, and by extension, perhaps to Sarah herself. An agent pulled up immigration records, cross-referencing the village of Imsker with US entry points. The results hit Sarah like a punch. There was only one name from Imsker who had entered the United States in the past decade, aside from her own, her cousin, Idris, a man she hadn't seen since she was 16. A man who had vanished from Morocco after a dispute with a foreign oil company over land rights, land that Khalid Al-Rahman's company had acquired. The same man who had once told her, during a childhood walk to the well, that the Red Rock Split was a place where justice could not be denied. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The kidnapping wasn't random. It was revenge, 20 years in the making, delivered by a man who'd been cheated out of his ancestral home. And now that man was holding a 5-year-old girl in a cave system that only he and Sarah understood. The clock was ticking. 2 hours and 10 minutes remained. The FBI could send a tactical team to the Adirondacks, but they'd be navigating blind. The cave network was unmapped. The only person who could guide them, who could speak the language of the man they were hunting, was standing in a restaurant kitchen with flour on her shoes and a decision that no one should ever have to make. Tors laid it out bluntly. "If we send you in, it's your call, but Idris trusts no one. Your voice on the line might be the only thing that keeps that girl alive." Sarah didn't hesitate. She pulled off her apron, handed it to the nearest cook, and told the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world exactly what they needed to do. They went to war with a waitress as their lead negotiator. The caravan rolled out of Manhattan within the hour. 3 black SUVs, a mobile command unit disguised as a plumbing truck, and the quiet hum of a satellite link that patched the FBI directly into the ears of every agent in the field. Agent Tors sat in the lead vehicle, her laptop open to a live feed of the Adirondack Forest, but the real command center was the back seat, where Sarah huddled over a hand-drawn map sketched from memory. She had never been to those caves. She'd only heard about them in stories whispered by her grandmother at night. Stories about the outsiders who'd hidden there during the French occupation, the smugglers who'd moved goods through the passages, and the jinn who guarded the deepest chambers. Those were fairy tales. Now they were coordinates. As they drove north, the FBI's behavioral analysts worked overtime. They'd pulled Idris's file, a man in his early 40s, unmarried, no known criminal record in the United States, but flagged by Moroccan intelligence for involvement in anti-government protests a decade ago. He'd entered the US on a student visa, overstayed, and vanished. For 5 years, no one had heard a whisper, until he resurfaced in the most catastrophic way possible, kidnapping the daughter of the man he blamed for his family's ruin. The land dispute was real. In 2004, Khalid Al-Rahman's company had acquired mineral rights to a stretch of the High Atlas near Imskir, promising development and jobs. But the drilling poisoned the water table, the promised schools never materialized, and the villagers were pushed off their ancestral plots with compensation checks that bounced. Idris's father had been one of the holdouts. He'd refused to sell. One night, his house burned down. The official report said faulty wiring. Idris knew better. He'd been carrying that rage for 20 years, molding it into a plan that would finally make Khalid feel the same helplessness his father had felt. But here's where it got more terrifying. Idris wasn't working alone. The FBI's surveillance team intercepted a cell phone ping from the cave system, and the number wasn't just local. It was traced to a burner purchased by a private security operative who'd once been employed by Khalid's own firm. A man named Eric Johansen, a former Marine with a dishonorable discharge and a grudge against the oil industry. He'd been inside Khalid's organization, knew the routines, knew the school's security gaps, and he'd been feeding Idris information for months. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It was an inside job powered by a transnational grudge, and now the two men were holed up in a cave system that seemed designed by nature to resist any tactical assault. Sarah absorbed this revelation with a cold calm that surprised even Tors. She'd always believed her cousin was a victim, a quiet boy who'd been broken by forces beyond his control. But now, he'd crossed a line that no grievance could justify. He was holding a child at gunpoint, and Sarah was the only person on Earth who could talk to him in the language of their shared childhood, the Tashilhit dialect that had been a comfort, not a weapon. The convoy reached the trailhead at dusk. The cave entrance was a slit in a limestone face, barely visible through the pines. Thermal imaging showed 2 heat signatures deep inside, one adult-sized, moving in agitated bursts, the other small, still, terrifyingly still. The clock had ticked down to 47 minutes. Tors handed Sarah a tactical vest and a wire. You go in alone, no visible weapons. You speak to him in the dialect. If the girl is hurt, we breach. If he so much as raises a voice, we breach. You are not a hostage negotiator. You are a cultural bridge. Use it. Sarah slipped the earpiece in, adjusted the vest, and walked into the darkness. The cave smelled of wet rock and old ash. The beam of her flashlight carved a narrow path through the blackness, illuminating ancient graffiti and scattered bones from small animals. She followed the sound of a child humming, a nursery rhyme in Arabic. The song Layla's mother used to sing. Khalid must have told her, must have played it to keep her calm. The sound was coming from a chamber just ahead, and then Idris stepped into the light. He was thinner than she remembered, his hair now streaked with gray, his eyes hollowed by years of rage and solitude, but the recognition was instant. He stared at her as if seeing a ghost. Sarah, his voice was hoarse, disbelieving. You were the last person I expected. They sent you, Sarah answered in their grandmother's dialect, her voice steady. They didn't send me. I came because I know the truth about what happened to your father, and I know you don't want to be the monster they made you. Idris laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the cave walls. You think you know the truth? The truth is that Khalid Al-Rahman's company killed my father, stole my land, and the world applauded. The truth is that justice doesn't exist for people like us, so I will create my own. He gestured toward a bundle in the corner. Layla was there, bound but alive, her eyes wide and tear-streaked, her mouth taped. She was alive. The thermal signature had lied, or the FBI's equipment had misinterpreted. The stillness was not death, it was terror. Sarah took a step closer, but Idris raised a hand. Don't, I didn't want her, I wanted him. I wanted Khalid to feel what I felt when my father's house burned. The ransom was never about money, it was about proving a point. Then prove it by letting her go, Sarah said. You've made your point, the world is watching, but the child is not the enemy. I am not the enemy. You can still choose to be the boy who used to chase goats with me, not the man who holds a little girl hostage. Idris's face flickered. For a single breath, the rage receded and she saw the cousin she remembered. But then the radio on his belt crackled, Eric's voice sharp and paranoid. What's going on in there? I'm seeing movement outside. They're setting up a perimeter. Idris's eyes snapped back to steel. You brought them. Of course you did. You think I'm a fool. Sarah kept her voice low, the dialect flowing like water over stones. The perimeter was coming whether I helped or not. But the only thing standing between you and a bullet is me. Let me walk her out. Surrender, I will speak for you. I will tell them the whole story, the real story, what Khalid's company did. You won't die in this cave. You'll die in a courtroom maybe, but you won't die here. And that girl won't die at all. Outside, the FBI snipers were in position. The thermal readings had shifted. The smaller figure was now moving, a flash of hope. But another signal appeared on the satellite feed, a third heat source approaching from the north. Johansen had reinforcements, or he'd set a trap. This was the it gets worse moment. The cave network wasn't a two-man operation. It was a cell, and Idris was just the voice. The real architect was Johansen, who'd been running a private extortion ring for years, using disgruntled locals as pawns. Sarah's cousin was expendable, Layla was the bait. And now, as the third figure closed in, the FBI realized they'd walked into a well-prepared ambush. Tors whispered into Sarah's earpiece, "We've got a new player. Do not exit the cave. Repeat, do not exit. The situation has escalated." Sarah had seconds to adapt. She looked at Idris, who was now wrestling with the radio, and made a choice. She dropped the dialect and switched to English, loud enough for the wire to catch. "Idris, Johansen is going to kill you. You're just cannon fodder. He's got a third man approaching from the north. You need to trust me. Together we can walk out. You don't have to die for him." Idris stared at her, the radio still crackling. And then from the darkness beyond the chamber, a new voice, Johansen's, amplified by the cave's acoustics. "She's lying. You know she's lying. Finish the job, Idris. Let the world see what happens to those who steal from us." A gunshot rang out, not from Idris, from the entrance. Johansen had arrived, and he wasn't alone. The FBI's perimeter was suddenly under fire, and the rescue mission had become a hostage standoff inside a natural fortress. Sarah grabbed Layla, pulling her behind a stalagmite, as Idris froze in the crossfire. The waitress who had only wanted to translate a phone call was now in the middle of a firefight, holding a billionaire's daughter, staring down a man she'd once climbed trees with, and praying that the grandmother who'd taught her the language of the mountains had also taught her the language of mercy. And then the satellite feed blipped. The third heat signature had entered the cave. It was moving fast, and it wasn't firing at the FBI. It was firing at Johansen. The tide had turned. But whose side was the newcomer on? And would Sarah and Layla survive the next 5 minutes to find out? The third heat signature wasn't a ghost, a trick of the satellite, or another one of Johansen's hired guns. It was Yusef, Idris's younger brother, a man who had spent the last decade trying to claw his sibling back from the edge of a void that had swallowed their entire family. Yusef had heard about the kidnapping on a Moroccan diaspora radio station that morning, a frantic bulletin about a rare dialect and a little girl named Layla. He'd recognized the landmarks instantly. He'd driven through the night, cutting across 2 state lines, and when he reached the trailhead, he'd found one of Johansen's men guarding the entrance. The man was armed, but Yusef spoke the language of the mountains. He spoke it with the authority of someone who'd survived worse than a mercenary with a radio. The guard had hesitated, and Yusef had disarmed him with nothing but words and the weight of a shared heritage. Now, as gunfire echoed through the cave, Yusef charged into the darkness armed with a rifle he'd taken from the man outside, and a lifetime of guilt that he had never been able to save his brother before. He found Idris frozen in the chamber, his gun half-raised towards Sarah, his face a mask of anguish and rage and confusion. Johansen was 20 feet away, crouched behind a rock formation, shouting into a dying radio. Yusef didn't shout orders, he didn't threaten, he simply spoke in Tashilhit, the same dialect their mother had used to sing them to sleep. "Brother, it's over, the girl is innocent. The world already knows the truth about the land, about father. Don't let this be your last chapter." Idris's hand trembled, the gun lowered an inch. Johansen, realizing his pawn was wavering, fired 2 shots wildly into the dark. One struck the cave wall, showering Sarah and Layla with chips of limestone. The other hit Yusef's rifle, spinning it from his grip. But Yusef was already moving, tackling Johansen to the ground with the same ferocity he'd once used to defend their father's property from company bulldozers. The fight was brutal and brief. Johansen was larger, but Yosef fought with the desperation of a man who had already lost too much. He pinned the former Marine's arm, wrenched the weapon free, and held him down until the FBI tactical team flooded the chamber, their muzzle lights slicing through the dust and shadows. Sarah clutched Layla to her chest, the little girl shaking violently, her tape-sealed mouth trembling. The first thing Sarah did was peel the tape away as gently as she could. Layla gasped, and then she spoke, not in English or Arabic, but in the only word she seemed to remember from the lullabies her mother had taught her. Mama. Sarah held her tighter. Agent Torres was the second person through the breach. She saw the tableau, Yosef on top of a subdued Johansen, Idris slumped against a stalagmite, his weapon on the ground, his eyes empty. And Sarah holding the child, her apron long gone, her face streaked with cave dust and tears. Clear, Torres said into her radio. We have the child, she's alive. The next minutes dissolved into a blur of paramedics, flashing cameras, and the surreal sight of Khalid Al-Rahman sprinting up a rocky trail in a suit that cost more than most people's cars. He didn't care about the mud or the reporters or the agents trying to hold him back. He saw his daughter, her small arms reaching for him, and he collapsed to his knees in the dirt. The reunion was not the silent, dignified moment the media expected. It was raw, loud, and profoundly human. Khalid sobbed. Layla sobbed. The billionaire who had never shed a tear in a boardroom wept like a child, his cries echoing through the trees that had so nearly become a tomb. He kissed his daughter's hair, her cheeks, her hands. He thanked God in Arabic and English and every language he knew. And then he looked up, searching the crowd of agents and paramedics until he found the woman who had made it all possible. Sarah stood apart, watching the reunion with a quiet smile, her arms wrapped around herself. Khalid approached her, his legs unsteady, and did something none of his business associates would have believed. He bowed his head. You translated more than words, he said, his voice cracking. You translated hope. I have no way to repay you. Sarah shook her head, her voice soft but steady. You don't need to repay me. I just remembered what my grandmother taught me: when you can help, you must. But Khalid would not be dissuaded. He was a man who measured life in transactions, but this was a debt that could never be settled. Still, he would try. The aftermath unfolded over weeks and months, each revelation reframing what the world thought it knew. Idris confessed to his role in the kidnapping, but in a remarkable turn, he also turned state's witness. With Yosef's encouragement and Sarah's promise to testify on his behalf, he provided the FBI with a detailed account of Johansen's wider extortion network, a sprawling operation that had targeted half a dozen wealthy families across the East Coast, using vulnerable immigrants as pawns. Johansen, the man who had masterminded it all while hiding behind a badge of private security, was sentenced to life in prison without parole. His network crumbled. Idris, after a trial that highlighted the decades of injustice his family had suffered, received a reduced sentence of 15 years. He would serve his time in a U.S. federal prison, but his testimony ensured that dozens of other victims would find justice. The most surprising detail emerged during the investigation, a fact the FBI didn't announce at first. When analysts examined the original ransom call, they discovered that Idris had deliberately embedded cultural markers in his threats, landmarks, legends, and phrases that only someone from his grandmother's village could decode. He hadn't done it to be clever. He had done it, he later admitted, because a part of him wanted to be stopped. He wanted someone who understood his pain to hear the hidden cry behind the ransom. He had planted a trail that led directly to his conscience. He just hadn't expected that the person who followed it would be his own cousin, carrying the voice of the grandmother who'd raised them both. Sarah attended every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery with her worn notebook, the same one she'd used to scribble translations in the restaurant's wine cellar. She visited Idris in prison, speaking to him in Tashilhit, reminding him of the stories their grandmother had told about the Red Rock and the lovers turned to stone. She didn't excuse what he'd done, but she refused to let him disappear into the system without someone who knew his name. And for the first time in years, Idris began to talk about the night his father's house burned down. He talked about the flames. He talked about the men in company uniforms who stood watching. He talked about the village elder who'd found him crying in the olive grove and said, "Justice will come, but not from your hands." He'd spent 2 decades trying to prove that elder wrong. Now he realized the elder had been right all along. The world, of course, had its own way of remembering the story. Headlines called Sarah the waitress who saved a billionaire's daughter. Talk shows clamored for interviews. A publisher offered her a book deal. But Sarah deflected the attention with the same quiet grace she'd used to navigate crowded dining rooms. She accepted only one request, a meeting with a group of linguistics professors from Columbia University who wanted to document the Tashilhit dialect before it vanished entirely. She spent 3 months recording her grandmother's stories, the same ones she'd heard as a child, the same ones that had saved a life. Those recordings are now housed in the Library of Congress, a permanent archive of a language that fewer than 1,200 humans still speak. Khalid al-Rahman, true to his word, established a foundation, not another vanity project, but a genuine effort to invest in the communities his company had once displaced. He funded a school in the village of Imskir, the first one that ever bore the name of a local hero, the Nadia al-Rahman School, named after his late wife. He also created a scholarship program for immigrant women working in the service industry, providing not just tuition money, but a stipend generous enough that they could afford to stop working double shifts. The first recipient was a young Moroccan woman named Samira who, like Sarah, had crossed an ocean with nothing but determination and a grandmother's wisdom. As for Sarah herself, she returned to work at Le Chateau, but only part-time. She'd enrolled in university, studying cultural anthropology, focusing on the preservation of endangered Berber languages. She still sent money to her family in Morocco, but now she also sent voice recordings of her lectures, knowing that her grandmother's spirit lived in every word she archived. She and Khalid remained in touch, not as billionaire and waitress, but as 2 people who had been broken and found each other in the rubble. He attended her graduation. She attended the opening of the school. On the 5th anniversary of Layla's rescue, the family held a quiet gathering in Central Park. Layla, now 10 years old, led the group to the carousel that her father had promised her on the morning of the kidnapping. As the horses rose and fell to tinny organ music, she turned to her father and asked the question that had been growing in her mind for years. "Baba, why did that man let me go?" Khalid looked at Sarah, who was sitting beside them. She answered for him, "Because his grandmother loved him just like yours loves you, and love is a language everyone understands." The carousel spun, the sun dipped behind the Manhattan skyline, and a waitress from a village no map had ever marked sat in the glow, knowing that she had bridged 2 worlds with nothing more than the memory of a voice that had once sung her to sleep. The billions couldn't buy that. No ransom could extort it. And no forgotten dialect could ever be erased, as long as there was someone willing to listen. Sarah still works at Le Chateau, though her name is now known far beyond that kitchen. She wipes down tables and carries trays. She listens, and she knows that the next emergency may be unfolding in a language no one else can hear. Her story is not just about a kidnapping. It is about the silent library every immigrant carries inside them, the dialects, the landmarks, the lullabies that no app can translate. The United Nations estimates that a language dies every 2 weeks. When the last elder in a village closes their eyes, a whole way of seeing the world vanishes. But on March 11th, one of those vanishing languages refused to be silenced. It reached across an ocean, threaded through a restaurant wall, and saved a child. The question now is not whether Sarah is a hero. It is how many other invisible Sarahs exist, busboys, cleaners, cooks, whose grandmother's wisdom is waiting for a moment that may never come unless we start paying attention. What would have happened if Sarah had been off that day, if she had been too afraid to step forward? The FBI had no backup plan. The richest man in the room had no power. Only a waitress, her apron streaked with coffee and dishwater, could read the ransom note written in a dying tongue. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that heroism wears no uniform, and subscribe to this channel so we can continue bringing you the incredible true tales that the world almost missed? Comment below. What language would you want preserved? And what story from your own family would you want the world to remember? Because in the end, the most valuable currency on earth is the one that can never be seized, ransomed, or forgotten. The voice of a grandmother, carried forward by those who still know how to listen.